Hello everyone, this is Mr. Lawback. I hope you are doing well. In this video, we're going to do a little bit of an intro to the progressive movement. So in terms of dates of the progressive movement, the 1890s through the 1920s, this is not a set in stone date range. It may have began a little earlier, it may have lasted a little longer, but this is generally the understanding of when the progressive movement was. Now, a main objective of the progressive movement was addressing problems caused by the following. Industrialization. Remember, during this time, the United States was industrializing, the second industrial revolution was occurring, and there were some issues that went along with that. So, trying to fix problems related to industrialization, also urbanization. Because of technology, there was not a need for as many people to be farmers. So, a lot of people left the countryside and moved to the cities where the jobs were. Urbanization, population growth created a lot of issues, and the progressive movement sought to fix those issues. And then the issue of immigration, the quote, new immigrants dealing with many of the issues that were concerning them. That was a big focus of the progressive movement as well. Political corruption, so not only at the national level, but also at the state and local levels. We talked earlier about Boss Tweed, so how could they fix local and state government? So we'll talk more about that, but a big issue for the progressive movement was fixing political corruption. The progressive movement was an effort to use government power to regulate and improve society. A big difference between the progressive movement and the reform movement that we talked about earlier was that the reform movement called for voluntary changes in society, not the government requiring these changes, where the progressive movement called for the government to make sure these changes and improvements were occurring. The progressive movement had a big issue with laissez-faire capitalism or the laissez-faire ideology. They believed that it was a very bad thing for society, for the government to allow business and big business to operate free of any type of regulation. Definitely keep in mind that the progressive movement did not like laissez-faire capitalism or complete hands-off regarding the economy with the government. However, they were not against capitalism. They believed that capitalism was salvageable. So many progressives did like the capitalist system. They just think it needed to be monitored or regulated a little better to protect people. Reformers were typically middle and upper class. Women were especially involved in the progressive movement, and there were many Christian ministers that were involved in this as well. So a lot of poor people living in the United States at this time couldn't really focus on being reformers. They were too busy working and trying to take care of their family, and in many cases were the victim of the negative and the bad situation that the progressive movement was trying to fix. Christianity and the progressive reforms oftentimes went hand in hand. So as I mentioned earlier, there definitely was a Christian vibe to the progressive movement. And one of the big movements was the social gospel movement. There were a lot of Christian principles that were ingrained in that. Many progressives were highly educated and decided to apply principles of medicine, law, business, and teaching to the problems of society. So they tried to fix society, progressives did, through their profession. The progressive movement did not have a unifying set of goals or leaders. So there was not one leader that was the begin-all, end-all of the progressive movement. There were many factions within the progressive movement. There was a lot of disagreements in the progressive movement as well. So not all progressives agreed on the best way to fix society's problems. So as we mentioned earlier, the progressive movement was not united, and the number of topics that they addressed was very vast. So there was environmentalism. A big proponent of environmentalism was a guy named John Muir, who also started the Sierra Club, which is still around today. So you will see the discussion between preservation and conservation, where preservation was that natural resources of the country should not be touched, whereas in conservation, the United States should use their resources but work to conserve them. So John Muir was a big name in environmentalism. Immigration, as mentioned earlier, we have the wave of new immigrants and immigrants from Asia. So how should they best be handled by society? Under laissez-faire capitalism, there was not a lot of room to protect the rights of consumers. So the progressive movement aimed to protect the rights of consumers. The temperance movement, so this is associated with the Prohibition. We know that the temperance movement had been going on for quite some time in American society. You have the argument between dry and wet, those in favor of the banning of alcohol and those that believed alcohol should be protected. You have the Anti-Saloon League, which is one of the organizations which looked to advance the temperance movement. The 18th Amendment actually was the prohibition and banned the sale, purchase, consumption of alcohol. Suffrage was a big issue during this time. The 19th Amendment, which happened at the end of the Progressive Era, was ratified in 1920, and a big push was because of World War I. Following World War I, Woodrow Wilson got behind the effort of women's suffrage, and the 19th Amendment was ratified. Child labor. The National Child Labor Committee, or the NCLC, was a private nonprofit organization and was a leading proponent for national child labor reform. Political reforms, and we'll talk more about this on the next slide, but can't think about the progressive movement without the many calls for political reform. Let's go over some major political efforts during the progressive movement. Initially, the progressive movement operated chiefly at the local level, but later it expanded to the state and national levels, and we'll give some examples in a moment. The progressive movement amendments, first, the 16th Amendment, which was ratified in 1913, gave the federal government the power to collect income tax. So prior to this, tariffs were the number one revenue raiser for the federal government. But after the 16th Amendment, personal income tax would be the number one revenue raiser for the federal government. The 17th Amendment established that senators should be directly elected. This allowed for a direct election of senators. And then the 18th Amendment in 1917 was Prohibition. Needless to say, Prohibition was considered widely to be a failure, as we saw an increase in organized crime because of this. And there was a lot of outcry that Prohibition was not a good thing. And the 18th Amendment ended up being repealed by a later amendment. But the 18th Amendment, Prohibition. The 19th Amendment was women's suffrage, which guaranteed women the right to vote. They could not be prevented having the right to vote because they were a woman. So that was in 1920 at the very end of the progressive movement. Now, political reforms. When we think of political reform, we should think of an individual named Robert La Follette, and he was credited with the Wisconsin idea. So he was a member of Congress, eventually would be the governor of Wisconsin. And here were some of his progressive ideas. He believed in direct primaries, secret ballots where the public would not know who people voted for. This was viewed as a very important step towards more democracy by Robert La Follette and the Wisconsin idea. Recall elections. So if political officials were elected and the voters didn't like what they were doing, they could be recalled, which we will see from time to time. Initiatives. These were where voters could actually vote for or put a proposed law on the ballot that they would be able to vote for. Referendums, where the legislative branch of a state or a local government could put a ballot referendum on election day, and the voter would then be able to decide whether they were for or against a law in a yes or no vote. So the opportunity for the public to actually vote on laws. That's what initiatives and referendums were. Now I want to take a few moments and just go over a couple of the bigger items from the progressive era. So you'll hear the term muckrakers. Now, this was a term coined by Teddy Roosevelt, and he didn't mean it in a positive way, although the term stuck. These muckrakers were journalists, members of the media, that tried to expose a lot of the corruption and wrongdoing that was going on in society. Not only in society, but the economy and business practices. Some of the main muckrakers were Jacob Riis, Ida Tarbell, Upton Sinclair, who of course wrote The Jungle, Samuel McClure, and Lincoln Steffens. And we'll take a closer look at some of their works. Settlement houses. When we think settlement houses, we should think of Jane Addams, who started Hull House, which was in Chicago. So in the settlement house movement, the middle class leaders joined underserved urban neighborhoods and opened their homes to local children, parents, families, and older adults. And this was also extended to immigrants. Again, Jane Addams, definitely someone that we want to think about when we think about the settlement house movement. Now for the progressive era presidents. So you have Teddy Roosevelt, and he is best known for the square deal, and he was the first conservation president. He is often seen as the main progressive president. He was a Republican. William Howard Taft, he was more of a trust buster than Teddy Roosevelt, but he is not given as much credit. Woodrow Wilson, the only Democratic president that was in the progressive era, and he called for tariff reductions, banking reform. He actually created the Fed, or the Federal Reserve System, where the government would oversee banking and the amount of money that was in circulation. And the Federal Reserve System we often refer to as the Fed. So let's take a few moments and look at some notable images from the progressive movement. This is a very famous political cartoon. This is supposed to be Teddy Roosevelt right here, and it says meat scandal. And this is certainly tied with the muckraking. And on this rake here, where the muckraking is taking place, says investigation on this rake here. And Teddy Roosevelt, of course, holding his nose. So a very famous political cartoon. The caption here says, "A nauseating job, but it must be done." This image is the cover of The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which exposed a lot of the corruption and eventually led to some significant legislation. You might have read this book in your English classes. The Jungle, definitely a progressive movement piece of literature that we should think of by Upton Sinclair. This is a pretty famous picture of two individuals. This is Teddy Roosevelt right here, the first conservation president. And then this is John Muir, who is the founder of the Sierra Club. The main difference between these two was that Teddy Roosevelt advocated for conservationism, whereas John Muir advocated for preservation, or completely leaving natural resources alone. Whereas Teddy Roosevelt said, we should use the natural resources, but we should be careful to conserve them as much as possible. Here is another famous illustration from the Prohibition movement. As you can see, women were very active in the Prohibition movement. You can take a look at some of their signs, why they march for this. Let us help you vote. So you've got sort of a women's suffrage involved as well. Help us buy your vote, prohibition. We've got more about votes and voting dry for the ban of alcohol. Whenever you see voting dry in this context, that's what that means. Purity is our motto. And then conversely, here you have people that are protesting prohibition. You can see there are some men with American flags and signs that say, "We want beer." Here is McClure's magazine. I noted earlier that McClure was one of the muckrakers, so McClure's magazine. In this publication, they would often expose a lot of the corruption that was taking place. And you would see here this issue for January. You can see an industrial factory in the background. And then here's a very powerful picture, child labor. As you can see, these very young kids here that were working in factories, in many cases under very dangerous conditions. Child here doesn't even have shoes on. And instead of being in school, they were working in the factories. Here is a picture of the three progressive era presidents. So this is Teddy Roosevelt right here. This is Woodrow Wilson right here. And this is Taft right here. Interesting little piece of information about Taft. He actually, not only was he the president, but he was also a Supreme Court Chief Justice.